Hi everyone, thanks for having us here. My name is Leigh Oshiro-Brantly,
Hi, Melissa Broudo.
and I am with Decriminalized Sex Work as well as New York Transgender Advocacy Group and the president of the New York State Gender Diversity Coalition.
And I'm legal director of Decriminalized Sex Work and the co-director of the New York City-based SOAR Institute, a longtime attorney and advocate for sex workers.
I'm also a longtime sex worker and I do multi-gendered sex work. I'm non-binary as well. We wanted to talk to you a little bit about the intersection of sex work and all of the sort of tentacles that it reaches around feminist labor and feminized bodies and those kinds of issues. So,
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about an issue that we're working on the state level in New York, which is the START Act, Survivors of Trafficking Attaining Relief Together, START. And the purpose is to allow survivors of all forms of labor trafficking to get a start on their lives by vacating their prior convictions that arose as a result of being trafficked. And the START Coalition, which includes a group of public defenders, appellate attorneys, local activists, sex workers, and other racial justice and criminal justice organizations, we're doing a push for March 8th, International Women's Day, to highlight this issue and how criminal justice reform relates to women's rights. And in this issue with survivors of human trafficking, especially into sex work related labor, arrests women and female presenting people, so trans women, non-binary people, especially people of color, are disproportionately impacted by criminalization, and therefore disproportionately hopefully will benefit from this bill if we are to pass it, which would expand people's ability to vacate all convictions that arose as a result of being trafficked.
yeah, and I think when we talk about labor, it's a large conversation, right? And so it's never really one-dimensional, and there are always multiple intersections of labor when it comes around to women and feminized bodies. So, when you think about labor, you can't really talk about feminist issues in a silo. You can't talk about it in a one-dimensional way. There are always intersectional issues around that. I think one of the things that we're seeing, particularly in New York State, is a sort of push to kind of think about sex work in a one-dimensional way, in a way that's kind of being hijacked by sort of a one-dimensional feminist narrative, one that maybe is kind of would be classified as a second wave feminist narrative, one that has sort of this idea that women and feminized people can never be sex workers of their own volition, that somehow it's inherently coercive to be a sex worker. And recently there's been a piece of legislation that was introduced to what they call partially criminalize sex work.
Thankfully not introduced yet.
Not yet,
they're
on their way.
threatening to introduce
Yes.
it.
Yes, not, and that's a good point. And this is sometimes referred to as the Nordic model, the Swedish model, the equality model. There's nothing equal about it, folks. It's definitely not equal. Partial decriminalization of what it is. It's basically
Right, and also known as the entrapment model.
Entrapment
right?
model,
I know
yeah.
that is, even though as a lawyer, it's not completely technically accurate to say entrapment, but it really is if we're going to specifically target clients as sex workers and have undercovers posing as sex workers, that certainly will have a lot of people feeling like it is entrapment.
Right. Maybe you could explain a little bit more what the bill actually is for folks who don't know what it is.
Yeah, so this bill, which the majority of the sex worker rights community opposes, and is yet to be introduced, they are labeling it as the equality model, and what it would do is criminalize clients of sex workers. So it essentially is, as Jay was saying, right, upholding this ideological model where all sex workers are seen as females, right, or feminized people, and then all clients are really seen as men or male.
No, also not true.
Right. And also that they are all sort of predators in a sense.
Right.
That they're the ones committing something
That's
that
true.
is illicit and should continue. It is currently criminalized, although they're not arrested. Disproportionately, sex workers are arrested. This would shift the burden to clients, but again, it's sort of presuming that they're doing something wrong, right? And that they're being exploitative and right, upholding the patriarchy essentially by being customers of the sex industry, which, right, as we know, that is a very sort of reductive, simplistic
Right.
image.
And as a person who has overwhelmingly queer, women, couple, trans folks as clients, this is highly offensive to me. And as a person who is also a client of sex workers, myself, it's also offensive. So the idea is that you would criminalize me one day and the next day you would not. So this like bifurcation of like either you're a sex worker or you're a client of sex workers is bizarre, right? Like either you're a doctor or you're not a doctor. Like no, one day you're a patient and one day you're a doctor. Right? Because it's labor, folks. It's labor. We need to have adult conversations that it's labor. So we need to start thinking about it as labor. And,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there is a full decrim bill in New York. And it has a very lengthy name, and I'm always blanking. We call it SEVESTA, Safe Sex Trade Act, Stop Violence in the Sex Trade Act. And so that has been reintroduced for this session. And I think what's important, I think we have many years for this battle to be fought in New York State, as so many other states. But what's important is that we are having these conversations, especially in the feminist arena. You know, this is definitely a extremely fraught historical issue within the feminist sphere. So it's important that we're having these conversations. And I mean, being in this movement for 20 years, you know, I've seen a tremendous shift in mainstream feminist thought, right? Back in the 90s when I first started from like an academic perspective, working on this issue, it was not, you know, it was a way less popular perspective to recognize sex work as labor. And now that is much more a given, you know, especially for younger generations of feminists. So I think that we are seeing a pretty big shift, you know, and shifts take time, but we're getting there.
We are. Across the United States, we're getting there in places like Oregon and Vermont. We have full decriminalization bills that are introduced in many other states as well. And so I think there is a shift that's happening, and we need to recognize it as such. And so, you know, support your local sex worker rights organization.
Definitely.
You know, because it is a part of a broader labor conversation that we're having on this International Women's Day and on this this strike day as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.